There is a belief so old that it existed before the first empire was built on African soil, before the first river was named, before the first word was written, and for centuries the world laughed at it, called it primitive, called it superstition, called it the thinking of people who did not know better. Something happened. Scientists, not elders, not priests, not storytellers, scientists began to study it, and what they found, they could not explain. This is the ancient African belief that science cannot disprove, and once you understand it fully, you will never see life, death, or the human soul the same way again. Long before the word consciousness existed in any Western language, African civilizations had already built entire systems of understanding around a single radical idea that the soul does not die, it transforms, it travels, and it returns. The Igbo of Nigeria called it gbanje, the Yoruba called it Àbíkú, the Akan of Ghana called it Sasa. 3 different languages, 3 different peoples, 3 different centuries, one identical belief. That is not coincidence. That is observation. These were not dreams. These were not myths invented to comfort the grieving. These were records kept by elders who watched, who waited, who remembered, and what they recorded across thousands of years has now begun to make scientists deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Here is what those ancient African elders understood, and here is what science is now quietly beginning to confirm. The human soul carries memory. Not just the memory of this life, the memory of lives before. Now, before you dismiss that, hear this. Dr. Ian Stevenson, University of Virginia, not a mystic, not a spiritual teacher, a medical psychiatrist. He spent 40 years collecting and investigating cases of children who claimed to remember previous lives. He documented over 3,000 cases. 3,000. And in a significant number of those cases, the children knew things they should not have known, names of people they had never met, locations of objects no one had told them about, details of deaths that had never been discussed in their presence. Some of those cases came from Western countries, but a striking number came from Africa, from communities where the belief in the returning soul was not questioned. It was simply known, and the elders of those communities did not celebrate Stevenson's findings. They simply nodded, as if to say, "Told you." But here is where it gets complicated, and this is the part no one talks about. Because when Stevenson published his findings, the scientific community did not celebrate him. They attacked him. Colleagues dismissed his methodology. Academic journals rejected his papers. His reputation was questioned by people who had never spent a single day in the field doing what he did. Why? Because his findings could not be easily fitted into the existing model of how the human mind works. And in science, what cannot be fitted into the existing model is not always investigated further. Sometimes it is simply buried, but the cases he documented did not disappear. They continued. Children kept being born who knew things they should not know. In Nigeria, in Ghana, in Senegal, in Uganda, in Congo, and the communities where these children were born, the Igbo, the Yoruba, the Akan, they already had a name for it. They already had a ritual for it. They already had a framework that thousands of years of observation had built brick by brick to hold exactly this truth. While Western science was only beginning to ask the question, Africa had already written the answer. Now, here is the question that nobody wants to answer out loud. If 3,000 documented cases investigated by a credentialed medical scientist could not be explained, why has mainstream science not pursued this further? Why is the study of past life memory still considered fringe? Some people say because the implications are too large. Because if the soul truly returns, then everything changes. The way we understand death changes. The way we understand birth changes. The way we understand consciousness, identity, justice, and time. All of it changes, and some systems, political, religious, economic, are not built to survive that kind of change. Others argue there is simply not enough evidence, that these cases, however compelling, are not proof, and that is a fair argument. But here is what is not a fair argument, that African civilizations could not have known something true. That because it came from oral tradition rather than a laboratory, it cannot be taken seriously. That is not science, that is bias. And the people it has hurt most are the very communities whose knowledge deserve to be heard. I want to know what you think. Drop it in the comments, because this conversation matters. But here is the part that changes everything. The part that makes this more than a debate between science and tradition. It is not just that African communities believed in the returning soul. It is what they did with that belief. The Igbo built entire naming ceremonies around identifying the returning soul. The Yoruba developed rituals specifically designed to release the Àbíkú from the cycle to give the returning child enough peace to stay. The Akan encoded the belief into their system of lineage, understanding that certain traits, certain gifts, certain burdens traveled with the soul across lifetimes. These were not stories told to make people feel better about losing a child. These were systems, precise, functional, tested across generations. And what makes them extraordinary is this: they were built without any contact with Eastern philosophy, without any knowledge of Buddhist teachings on reincarnation, without any Western metaphysical tradition. African civilizations arrived at this understanding on their own, from their own observation, from their own children. That is not superstition, that is independent discovery. So ask yourself something, and I mean really ask yourself, if three completely separate African civilizations across thousands of years each developed the same belief independently, what were they all seeing? What were they all experiencing generation after generation? Theet pointed them toward the same conclusion. Because the simplest answer the one science itself is supposed to honor is this: when multiple independent observers across different times and places arrive at the same conclusion, that conclusion deserves serious investigation. And Stevenson's research, for all its controversy, showed something that even his harshest critics had to acknowledge. Some of these children knew things that had no rational explanation. Not some of the time, in case after case after case. So here's the deeper question. If the soul carries memory across lifetimes, what does that say about who you are right now? What does it say about the knowledge you were born with, the things you understood too early, felt too deeply, knew without being taught? What if some of what you carry is not from this life? I want you to answer something in the comments. Not for the algorithm. For yourself. Have you ever known something without knowing how you knew it? Have you ever felt a place was familiar, a place you had never been? Have you ever met someone and felt with absolute certainty that you knew them from somewhere before? Leave your answer below, because I believe the comments on this video are going to be extraordinary. Here is what I believe, and I say this not as a scientist, not as an elder, but as someone who has sat with these stories long enough to feel their weight. The ancient African belief in the returning soul is not primitive. It is not superstition. It is not wishful thinking. It is the most sophisticated understanding of human consciousness that any civilization has ever produced, because it does not pretend that death is neat. It does not pretend that the soul is simple. It does not pretend that one lifetime is enough to contain everything a soul is meant to become. Science has not disproved this, and the more honestly science looks at the evidence, the more it finds itself standing exactly where African elders stood thousands of years ago, at the edge of something vast that cannot be fully explained, but cannot be denied. The belief is older than science, and it is still here. Draw your own conclusions. If this video made you think differently about what you thought you knew, then you already understand why this channel exists. Ancient African history is not here to entertain you with noise. It is here to give you the stories that were never meant to leave African soil. Stories that challenge, awaken, and restore. Subscribe and ring the bell. Because the next story we are uncovering one that rewrote the history of an entire continent, and nobody has told it like this before.